Jericho, a name that has crossed generations and that to this day arouses curiosity, mystery, and even fear. Imagine a city built in the middle of the desert, surrounded by walls so high they seem to touch the sky, and so wide that soldiers could march abreast. To its inhabitants, those imposing walls were more than just stacked stones. They were a symbol of invincibility. Those who lived within them believed they would never be defeated. But Jericho wasn't just a fortress. It was a pulsating center of life, wealth, and ostentation. A place where markets teemed with goods from distant lands, rare spices, fine fabrics, precious metals. Merchants, travelers, and warriors passed through its gates in search of opportunities. And those who entered Jericho saw not just a commercial center, but a spectacle of luxury and power. However, behind this brilliance lay shadows. Historical and biblical accounts describe Jericho as a city given over to idolatry, corruption, and immorality. Its temples were not spaces of pure devotion, but stages of dark rituals, practices that many today would hardly dare imagine. For its inhabitants, all of this was normal, acceptable, part of the culture. For the surrounding people, Jericho was a symbol of power, but also of decadence. Now stop for a moment and think with me. If you lived in that time, walking the streets of Jericho surrounded by gigantic walls, observing the wealth and confidence etched on the faces of every citizen, would you believe that any army, no matter how powerful, could have brought down that fortress? This is the first great provocation of this story. The curious thing is that the inhabitants of Jericho didn't just trust in their physical defenses. They also believed that their pagan gods would guarantee them protection and eternal prosperity. With every ritual performed in the temples, with every sacrifice offered, they believed they were strengthening not only the fertility of the land, but also the security of the city. And then comes the question that haunts us to this day. When a society places all its faith in walls, riches, and lifeless gods, what happens to it? The answer lies in the story of Jericho itself, a city that seemed indestructible, but in a matter of days was reduced to dust. What happened within those walls goes beyond what archaeology can explain. Biblical records speak of practices that contaminated the entire society and that would ultimately seal its fate. That's why the story of Jericho isn't just about falling stones, but about what happens when human arrogance defies the Creator. And look, before we continue, I want to extend an invitation. If this topic is already captivating you, like it now and subscribe to the channel. Here you'll find profound stories, surprising revelations, and reflections that will change the way you view the past and even the present. Now, we'll delve into the origins of this ancient city, discover how it flourished in the middle of the desert, and understand why it became the setting for one of the most impactful stories in the entire Bible and archaeology. But before we delve into the darker layers of this story, join our journey. Make sure you're already subscribed to the channel. Each new video is an open door to hidden truths that have been hidden from you for centuries. Jericho's history begins long before it became a fortified and prosperous city. In fact, it dates back to the dawn of human civilization itself. We're talking more than 10,000 years ago, at a time when much of humanity still lived nomadically, hunting, fishing, and gathering, without fixed routes, always on the move to survive. But amidst this landscape, something extraordinary happened. In the heart of what historians call the Fertile Crescent, a region stretching across the Middle East, known as the cradle of agriculture and urbanization, a group of people emerged who decided to settle in a specific spot, a plain marked by a rare gift in the middle of the desert, a freshwater spring. And where there is water, there is life. It was this natural spring that allowed the first families to settle in Jericho. With access to abundant water, they were able to cultivate wheat, barley, fruits, and especially dates, which would later earn the city the title of City of Palms. While other peoples still wandered in search of food, the inhabitants of Jericho learned to tame the land. They not only planted and harvested crops, but also developed pioneering irrigation and food storage techniques. This innovation transformed Jericho into one of the world's first urban centers. Rudimentary stone houses began to be built, and over time, the first walls appeared, erected not only to protect against invaders, but also against the hostile nature of the desert. Archaeological discoveries confirm this prominence. Excavations have revealed structures dating back millennia before Rome, the Egypt of the pharaohs, or Babylon. Stone walls, over 5 meters high, already existed in Jericho, when much of the world had yet to experience what it meant to live in a fixed community. This leads many scholars to recognize Jericho as the oldest continuously inhabited city in human history. But here's the most fascinating point. Jericho's early prosperity wasn't limited to agriculture. Its location was strategic, right on the path of trade routes connecting different regions. Merchants passed along its roads bringing spices, fabrics, precious metals, and new ideas. This made the city not only prosperous but also culturally rich, a melting pot of influences that shaped the character of its inhabitants. However, along with abundance and progress also came risks. Whenever man prospers, there is a temptation to forget the Creator and rely solely on his own strength. In Jericho, this self-sufficiency began early. The same spring that was seen as a divine blessing became idolized as an entity, and over time, false gods were erected, receiving increasingly extravagant temples and rituals. Do you see how this story parallels today? When everything is going well, when the table is plentiful and the walls seem secure, many forget that life depends not only on what accumulates, but on who sustains it all. And here is the great lesson Jericho has taught us since its origins. All abundance without purpose turns into arrogance, and all arrogance paves the way for downfall. But before the ruin, there was splendor, and it's this splendor we'll discuss in the next chapter. The riches, trade, and ostentation that transformed Jericho into one of the most envied centers of the ancient world. Jericho was not just an ancient city, it was a true symbol of wealth, ostentation, and power in the heart of the Middle East. For any traveler approaching its immense stone and mud walls, the sight was impressive. Towers that seemed to touch the sky, gates reinforced with precious metals, and streets teeming with activity. Passing through its gates, one felt as if one had entered another world, a world of abundance and luxury that few cities could offer. Within its walls, Jericho bustled like an international marketplace. Merchants from distant lands brought rare spices, fine fabrics, precious stones, and valuable metals. Colorful carpets came from Persia, perfumes from Arabia, copper and tin from faraway regions. Everything circulated through the bustling streets, transforming Jericho into a veritable economic hub of antiquity. But it wasn't just commerce that drew attention. The homes of wealthy nobles and merchants were veritable palaces, decorated with luxurious tapestries, gold and silver utensils, and statuettes dedicated to the gods they believed protected their fortunes. While the common people lived in dwellings of mud and stone, Jericho's elite enjoyed banquets, parties, and rituals filled with wine, music, and excesses of every kind. An abundance of food was also part of daily life. Thanks to the freshwater spring within the walls, the city produced large quantities of dates, wheat, and barley. Furthermore, the granaries were always brimming with grain and olive oil, ensuring there was never a shortage of food, even during long military sieges. This led the inhabitants to believe their city was invincible, immune to the famine and scarcity that plagued other regions. However, this sense of invulnerability had a dangerous effect: arrogance. Rulers and religious leaders became increasingly corrupt. The money circulating in markets was used not only to enrich themselves, but also to fuel idolatrous cults and pagan rituals. Altars were erected in honor of foreign gods, and in these temples, practices that would be shocking today were seen as part of the culture. Human sacrifices, sacred prostitution, and ritual immorality were common, and few dared to question such customs. This is the stark contrast of Jericho. While it boasted luxury and prosperity, it was plunged into a moral decay that spread like a shadow across its streets. Festivals became synonymous with loss of control, rituals of faith transformed into cults of corruption, and absolute trust in its physical walls blinded its inhabitants to the spiritual fragility in which they were immersed. And here is the question that echoes to this day: what good is living surrounded by luxury and riches if the heart of society is corrupt? Jericho believed its safety lay within its walls, but it ignored the fact that no wall can protect a people who abandon principles of justice and truth. This lesson is as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. How many modern cities are following the same path? Cities that boast technology, skyscrapers, and wealth, but hide behind the lights a silent moral and spiritual degradation. If there was anything that truly defined Jericho, It wasn't just its imposing walls or its markets filled with precious goods. The heart of the city beat to a different rhythm, that of idolatry, corruption, and immorality that dominated daily life. Within the walls, where many saw prosperity and luxury, in fact lurked a dark reality that eroded values and destroyed the very essence of its people. Temples erected in honor of pagan gods were the center of the city's spiritual life. But unlike the cult of the sacred as we understand it today, they celebrated the most decadent aspects. Human sacrifices were offered in blood rituals, in the belief that a child's life could guarantee abundant harvests or military victories. And while the innocent were delivered to the altars, religious leaders and rulers lived surrounded by power, luxury, and permissiveness. Sacred prostitution was another common practice. Women were taken to temples and forced to participate in sexual rituals, considered by the inhabitants to be a way to please the fertility gods. What was seen as spiritual devotion was, in fact, a reflection of institutionalized immorality. For the people, these rituals were not sinful, but a religious obligation. Morality was so distorted that right and wrong no longer knew boundaries. Furthermore, corruption was rampant at every level. Rulers exploited the poorest citizens, levying exorbitant taxes to support endless banquets and parties. Judges sold sentences to the highest bidder, and justice was merely an illusion for those without power or wealth. In Jericho, money bought everything: security, influence, political decisions, and even the false blessing of the gods. And it didn't stop there. Idolatry also manifested itself in homes. Statues and images of foreign gods decorated the houses, and families placed their trust in these stone and metal figures, believing they would guarantee prosperity and protection. The true God had been completely forgotten. In his place, the city bowed to beliefs that promised immediate pleasure and fleeting rewards. The consequences of this lifestyle were clear. The city became a center of excess. Wine flowed freely at parties. Banquets were lavish, and the desire for limitless pleasures replaced any sense of discipline. Luxury and immorality went hand in hand, creating a culture in which people increasingly believed themselves above judgment. But history shows us a dangerous pattern. Every society that abandons the principles of truth and justice to indulge in excesses ultimately reaps destruction. It was so with Sodom and Gomorrah. It was so with Rome at its height, and it was so with Jericho. Corruption and idolatry not only distanced the people from the Creator, but also created a false sense of security, as if their physical walls were enough to protect them from any threat. What the inhabitants of Jericho didn't realize was that their walls couldn't defend the city from divine judgment. Every immoral ritual, every unjust sacrifice, and every act of corruption were invisible bricks building not protection, but their own downfall. This part of history serves as a mirror for our own times. How many modern societies are also steeped in idolatry, placing their trust in money, power, or momentary pleasures? How many lives surrounded by luxuries but feel empty inside, far from what truly matters? And now I want to hear from you. If you were living in Jericho at that time, what would shock you most? The human sacrifices in the temples, the corruption of the rulers, or the sacred prostitution used as a religious cult? Comment below, because your insight could spark important reflection for all of us. Within the walls of Jericho, it wasn't just the riches, temples, and markets that drew attention. There was also a question that profoundly shaped the city's life: the role of women. After all, what was the position of women in a society steeped in idolatry, corruption, and immoral practices? Did they have a voice, influence, and power, or were they reduced to mere instruments of pleasure and religious manipulation? The truth is that Jericho presented a stark contrast. On the one hand, some women belonging to noble and commercial families held a certain prestige. They could influence political decisions, negotiate alliances, and even manipulate power relations within the city. Some of them were linked to pagan cults and held priestly functions, which granted them visibility and authority. In the eyes of the people, they were respected, almost untouchable. But this wasn't the reality for most. For most ordinary women, life in Jericho was marked by submission and exploitation. Many were given away in arranged marriages, seen as commodities to be traded to strengthen alliances between families or political groups. Others were used as part of religious rituals, in ceremonies where their bodies became objects of worship in the name of false gods. So-called sacred prostitution was one of the most shocking practices. In temples dedicated to Baal and Ashtoreth, women were forced to engage in sexual rituals with priests and foreigners, believing this would bring fertility and prosperity to the land. What should have been an expression of spirituality turned into moral degradation. Women ceased to be human beings and became mere instruments in the name of religion. This custom was not seen as shameful by the population. On the contrary, it was considered an act of devotion. This shows how immorality in Jericho had become cultural and institutionalized. Generations grew up believing this was the right path, and anyone who dared question it was seen as an enemy of the gods. However, not all women lived in complete submission. The biblical story presents us with the figure of Rahab, a prostitute who, despite being immersed in this environment of immorality, made a different choice. When the Israelite spies arrived in the city, it was she who protected them and risked her life for them. Rahab, despite living in a context of spiritual and moral corruption, recognized that the God of Israel was the true Lord, and this decision changed not only her life but also the fate of her family. Rahab's presence demonstrates something important. Even when an entire society is steeped in depraved practices, there are always those who choose to go against the grain. She became a symbol of faith and redemption amid the chaos of Jericho. Looking at this painting, we realize that the woman in Jericho symbolized two realities. On one hand, power and influence used to sustain corrupt and idolatrous systems. On the other, submission and exploitation in the name of religion and politics. But above all, we see that even amidst the deepest decline, there is room for choices that transform stories. This contrast is extremely timely. Today, many women still struggle against systems of exploitation, inequality, and injustice. The story of Jericho is not just a distant tale, but a reminder of how societies can distort women's value when they stray from principles of truth and dignity. If you had been in Jericho at that time, which of these realities do you think would have been harder to bear? The arranged marriages without choice, the rituals of sacred prostitution, or the submission to a corrupt system? Leave your opinion in the comments, as it could spark powerful reflection for all of us. Upon passing through the gates of Jericho, any traveler encountered a breathtaking scene. The streets were wide and bustling, filled with merchants offering spices from distant lands, rare fabrics, precious stones, and luxury items, found only in powerful urban centers. The city pulsed like a great economic heart, supplying and enriching its inhabitants. But behind all this splendor lurked a dark reality that few dared to face. The homes of the elite were built with sophisticated architectural details for the time. Walls decorated with colorful tapestries, carved wooden furniture, and gold and silver objects displayed the prestige of the wealthiest families. Wine-soaked parties, endless banquets, and lavish celebrations were common. The abundance of food, a result of the region's fertility and intense trade, transformed every meal into a veritable spectacle of ostentation. The central market was the heart of the city. There, merchants from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and other distant regions brought goods that made Jericho a strategic point. Salt, essential for preserving food, rare spices that added flavor and status, fine fabrics that only the wealthiest could afford, and precious metals that adorned both temples and homes. Visitors to Jericho saw a city that seemed to prosper without limits, but this prosperity came at a cost. Rulers and priests exploited trade to amass even more wealth, exploiting the common people. While some lived in extreme luxury, many survived in precarious conditions, supporting the excesses of the elite with their labor. It was an unequal society where the opulence of the few contrasted with the poverty of the many. Furthermore, luxury was not accompanied by spiritual or moral responsibility. On the contrary, the more wealth circulated within the walls, the more corruption and idolatry intensified. Temple festivities were marked by excessive banquets, questionable rituals, and the insatiable pursuit of pleasure. Gold and silver, which should have been used for the collective good, ended up decorating images of pagan gods and fueling ceremonies that distanced the city from its true creator. It's curious to see how wealth, when not guided by solid values, can become an instrument of destruction. Jericho, which began as a miracle of civilization, became a symbol of moral and spiritual decay. Its imposing walls, bustling markets, and luxurious homes gave a false impression of security and eternal prosperity. But behind this sheen, the city was already in the process of self-destruction. This scenario is not unique to Jericho. Human history repeatedly shows that when a society places its trust solely in wealth and power, it inevitably becomes corrupt. Rome, Babylon, Sodom, and Gomorrah all followed similar paths. Jericho was no exception, and its fall became an eternal reminder that no wall, no matter how strong, can support a city that abandons the principles of justice and truth. Thus, Jericho's luxury was not only a sign of prosperity, but also a reflection of its vulnerability. The glitter of gold blinded the eyes of its leaders, while the city's heart turned ever further away from God. If there was one thing that made Jericho considered invincible, it wasn't just its riches or its strategic location. What truly impressed travelers, merchants, and even the most daring enemies were its walls. Imposing, massive, and seemingly indestructible, they not only protected the city, but also symbolized the unshakable confidence of its inhabitants. For many, those walls were not just human constructions, but a true shield against any external threat. According to archaeological discoveries, Jericho was one of the first cities in the world to erect defensive walls, and these were no simple walls. Imagine stone structures about 5 meters high, topped by an additional mud brick wall that could reach up to 7 meters higher. In total, these walls reached almost 12 meters high, the equivalent of a 4-story building. Furthermore, their width allowed soldiers to walk on them without difficulty, ensuring constant surveillance and a rapid response to any threat. Another factor that reinforced its security was its geographic location. Jericho was situated on a small natural elevation, which made any attempted attack even more difficult. Invaders would need to overcome not only the city's defenses, but also the disadvantages of the terrain. From the top of the walls, soldiers could spot any approach and prepare in advance. The engineering of the walls was also astonishing for the time. Studies indicate that there were 2 main layers of defense: an outer wall made of solid stone and an inner wall made of brick, forming a virtually impregnable barrier. Between these 2 layers was a space that functioned as a sort of defensive corridor, where patrols could circulate. This fortification technique was far ahead of its time, reinforcing the idea that Jericho was not only a prosperous city, but also a milestone in the development of ancient military engineering. And it wasn't just the height or thickness of the walls that was impressive. The city gates were reinforced with high-strength metals and wood, capable of withstanding break-in attempts or enemy fire. Watchtowers along the walls allowed observation of the entire surrounding area, ensuring that nothing went unnoticed. Another fascinating detail was that Jericho possessed something few fortified cities did: a spring of water within its walls. This meant that even in the event of a prolonged siege, its inhabitants would not die of thirst. With storehouses full of grain and food, Jericho was prepared to resist for months, perhaps years, without surrender. This factor further heightened its residents' sense of invincibility, but as history has shown, no wall is high enough to prevent divine judgment. The walls of Jericho, which seemed unbreakable, crumbled before God's will in an inexplicable way, making it clear that it is not human engineering that guarantees true security, but obedience to the Creator. The fall of Jericho was not just a military or religious event, but a lesson that resonates to this day. No fortress built by human hands can withstand the will of God. Few ancient stories carry as much mystery and impact as the fall of the walls of Jericho. Imagine for a moment a city considered invincible, surrounded by fortifications that seemed to touch the sky, prepared to withstand months of siege, simply crumbling before a people who didn't even raise arms against its defenses. This isn't just history, it's a revelation that has marked generations and remains to this day one of humanity's most intriguing episodes. The Bible tells us in Joshua chapter 6 that God ordered a strategy completely outside military norms. For 6 days, the Israelites marched in silence around the city, accompanied by priests blowing ram's horns. No attacks, no attempts to scale the walls, no battering rams against the gates, just silence and faith. To the inhabitants of Jericho, this seemed provocative, even madness. But on the 7th day, something extraordinary happened. On the 7th lap, to the sound of trumpets and the great cry of the people, the walls simply crumbled. There were no bloody battles, no complex military strategies. What occurred was a clear demonstration that human strength, no matter how imposing, can never oppose divine power. But is there a rational explanation for this event? Many scholars have attempted to understand the mystery. Some suggest that the walls of Jericho could have been built on an unstable foundation, making them vulnerable to earthquakes. Indeed, the Jordan Valley region is located on a fault line where tremors are not uncommon. Thus, a coincidence would have caused a seismic shock to occur precisely at the moment the Israelites gave their final cry. But was it just a coincidence? Other experts hypothesized that the daily marches could have caused micro-vibrations in the ground, gradually weakening the wall's structure until they could no longer hold. Still, this explanation fails to account for the perfect synchronicity between the people's cries and the wall's collapse. And here's the bottom line. For those who believe, there's no doubt that it was God's hand that overthrew Jericho. It wasn't just a defeated city, it was a destroyed symbol, a reminder that no matter how great a fortress man builds, when God decides to act, nothing can remain standing. The fall of Jericho was more than a military victory, it was a message to all the nations of the time. The news spread quickly. The God of Israel was no myth, but a living God, capable of overthrowing in minutes what seemed unshakable. Neighboring kings trembled and entire peoples understood that they were facing not a mere army, but a people protected by the Almighty. And the most impressive thing is that this message remains relevant. How often do we build walls in our own lives? Walls of fear, pride, addiction, or unbelief. They seem indestructible, but before God's voice, they crumble in an instant. The fall of Jericho was not only a lesson for the ancients, but also for us. It proves that no human fortress can withstand divine faith and power. Now it's up to you. If you were inside Jericho seeing those immense walls crumble before your eyes, what would you feel first? Fear, amazement, or faith? When discussing Jericho, we cannot ignore the role of women within this society. After all, they were simultaneously symbols of power and victims of a system dominated by idolatry, corruption, and immorality. The way they were viewed and treated within the walls reveals much about the heart of that seemingly prosperous city, but which bore deep marks of decay. First, it's important to highlight that some women in Jericho, especially those linked to nobility and commerce, held status and influence. They could participate in decision-making, control property, and even exercise authority within families and markets. In a prosperous and strategically located city, many of them benefited from the trade in spices, rare fabrics, and precious metals that passed through its gates daily. However, this reality was only an exception. For most ordinary women, life was marked by submission and exploitation. Many were given away in arranged marriages, treated as bargaining chips in political or commercial alliances. Others were forced to participate in religious rituals in temples dedicated to pagan gods, where their beauty was used as a tool to satisfy dark beliefs and customs. Within these temples, so-called sacred prostitution was practiced. The inhabitants of Jericho believed that the fertility of the land was linked to human fertility. Therefore, women were offered in sexual rituals as a way to please gods, such as Baal and Ashtoreth. For them, this was not immorality, but rather a legitimate religious practice, a supposed guarantee of abundant harvests, protection from enemies, and prosperity. But did all these women accept this fate without question? The Bible shows us that this wasn't always the case. One of the most striking examples is that of Rahab, prostitute who, despite living in a context of idolatry and sin, chose to return to the God of Israel. She risked her own life to hide the spies sent by Joshua, and in return, her family was spared on the day of destruction. Rahab's act shows that, amidst an environment of corruption and decadence, there was still room for choices of faith and courage. This contrast is powerful. While many women were exploited and used as pawns in a power struggle, others demonstrated that it was possible to rise up against the system and strive for something greater. Jericho, therefore, becomes a reflection of humanity. On one side, abuse and decadence; on the other, hope and redemption. And here's the real insight. The way Jericho treated his women reveals the depth of his corruption. When a society loses respect for human dignity and turns people into objects to feed its own desires, it inevitably heads for ruin. And that's exactly what happened. The story of the women of Jericho, therefore, is not only about oppression, but also about resistance. It is a reminder that even in the darkest scenarios, there is always the possibility of choosing the path of faith and transformation. The fall of Jericho was not just a historical event or a distant biblical account. It carries with it timeless lessons that continue to resonate to this day. More than just toppled walls, it is a clear message about the fate of societies that choose to stray from divine principles and indulge in corruption, pride, and immorality. What we see in Jericho reflects a pattern that repeats itself throughout human history. Whenever a people achieve prosperity, build fortifications, grow rich, and consider themselves invincible, they run the risk of forgetting the foundations that sustained them. Rome, Babylon, Sodom, and Gomorrah are classic examples of this. All flourished, but all collapsed, not for lack of wealth or armies, but for the moral and spiritual decay that corroded their foundations. The same happened with Jericho. Its inhabitants believed the walls would make them indestructible, that their pagan gods would guarantee abundance, and that nothing could shake their power. However, they forgot that no empire remains standing when its core values are abandoned. The end of Jericho shows that when arrogance replaces humility and when momentary pleasure takes the place of faith, downfall is only a matter of time. But what does this message have to do with us, living thousands of years later? Much more than we imagine. Today's world, like Jericho, has also built its walls. They are not made of stone and clay, but of trust in wealth, technology, and human systems. We live in a time when many believe that nothing can shake us, not economic crises, not conflicts, not even moral collapse. But the story of Jericho is a reminder that every human fortress is fragile before divine judgment. Another powerful point of this narrative is God's patience. He didn't destroy Jericho overnight. The city prospered for centuries, and during that time had countless opportunities to turn to the Creator. Rahab's story itself is proof that even amidst chaos, there was a chance for repentance and salvation. This shows that, even today, God continues to offer opportunities for people and nations to choose the right path. However, as in Jericho, when corruption becomes the norm, when idolatry replaces faith, and when morality is disregarded, the time comes when judgment is inevitable. This is the main lesson. No society can survive for long by ignoring spiritual principles and fundamental values. For us, the fall of Jericho is a call to reflection. Are we repeating the mistakes of that ancient city? Are we trusting more in our own walls than in divine protection? Or are we attentive to learning from the past and building a future based on values that truly sustain life and humanity? Jericho fell, and its fall was not just the defeat of a city, but an eternal symbol that human pride will always be overcome by divine power. And now I want to hear from you. Looking at the world today, do you think we're repeating the same mistakes as Jericho? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because this reflection could spark an incredible debate. If this story of Jericho has opened your eyes to how the past still speaks to today, then don't leave without liking and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss any of the upcoming content that will reveal hidden truths from history and the Bible. Turn on the bell because we still have many impressive revelations ahead. And now, share this video with someone who also needs to reflect on the walls in their life. Your participation makes all the difference in spreading this message.